I don't know about you, but after that, my heart is just full. And I'm just so grateful to be here with you talking about God and talking about the way that he moves in our lives and his ever presence in every moment and everything that we do. It just blows me away. I'm just so grateful to be part of this church. I'm so grateful to be part of this ministry. I'm so grateful to be here with you this morning. You know, the past few weeks we've been talking about running with the giants, which is the series we've been doing that's based out of Hebrews chapter 11, where there's this great roll call of witnesses, essentially these people from the Old Testament that we hear stories about, right? Like Abraham and Moses and Noah and all these people who acted in faith, believing that there was something great that was about to happen to them, right? And so in Hebrews, it tells us that we're surrounded by all of these people who came before us, and they're cheering us on. And I don't know about you, but that really encourages me. I hope it encourages you, because this is what it means. Essentially, all of the people who have ever lived have gone through everything, which means that there is no struggle that is unique to you. There is no thing that you are going to experience in this life that someone hasn't already experienced before that you can learn from. Today, I have the privilege and the honor to tell you about one of my favorite Bible characters. Her name is Esther. Right? And so in the book of Esther, we're going to see a lot of crazy things, and I have to tell you the whole story, but you're going to be blessed because Esther is going to teach you how to guide through difficult circumstances and to learn how to navigate your way in seasons of struggle, and that's incredible. And the book of Esther is insane because it has some unique features, and right at the very beginning, we're just going to jump right in here. You ready? The book starts with the king of Persia. He's throwing this huge, lavish party. And it's an intense party, like he's showing off all of his wealth. He's telling people that they can have as much to drink. And he not only has like the dignitaries at his house, he's invited essentially all of Persia. And this is a 6-month-long party. And he's doing this because he's feeling a little defeated because they had some bad battles in Athens. Maybe you heard of one of them when he battled 300 Spartans. Do you remember that? Yeah, that was him. And he was bummed about it. And that kind of is like setting the scene for this whole story. So he just wants to show off how mighty and how powerful he is, because he wants to encourage his people that he's a king that is worthy of being followed. So he throws this party, just showing off all of his wealth, but little does he know that by the end of this book, it's not going to be talking about how great the king is, but how great our God is. The other interesting thing about the book of Esther is that, speaking of God, he's not mentioned in the book at all. Yeah, there's no mention of his name. There's no mention of his presence. There's no talk about prayer. There's nothing really spiritual happening in this book. Now, you expect a book in the Bible to every other page is talking about God in some form or fashion, but he just doesn't show up. And actually, that's on purpose, because the writer of this book wants you to understand that God's people were in exile. Right? They had been kicked out of the land of Israel, and now they're living under this Persian king. A lot of them are living in this empire, and they're spread out throughout this kingdom, and God to them feels super far away. But what's interesting is that even though he's not expressly mentioned, what we learn is that even in these times, like, God is present always. Like, we see God's presence and God's providence acting throughout this entire story, protecting his people and getting them to where they need to be. So even though his name isn't mentioned, it couldn't be more obvious that God's hand is at work, even if they had mentioned him every other sentence, which they could. So they throw this party. The king is celebrating. He's showing off his wealth. You know how boys are. We don't just want to show off our stuff. We don't just want to show you the fancy car. We want to show you our women too. So the king's like, Queen Vashti, go get my queen. She's beautiful. She's the most gorgeous woman you've ever seen. Call her, because I want to show off her beauty to all my friends. And the queen's like, nuh-uh, you don't own me. You don't own this body. You can't just summon me. And so she refuses to come. Well, the king and all of the guys he's hanging out with freak out. So through a bunch of insecure male conversations that they have with each other, they decide she's setting a bad example for all the women in the kingdom. So they banish her, and she's no longer queen. She can't ever be in the presence of the king. And they decide that they're going to hold this beauty contest to find the most beautiful woman in Persia to replace Queen Vashti because she was disobedient. What's interesting, and you might not know this, little known Hebrew fact here, if you translate the name of this party from the Hebrew to the English, it actually translates the Bachelor Persia. Just kidding. It doesn't do that. But that would be funny though, right? But essentially, that's essentially what's happening. It's like you have all these beautiful women parading around, and it's the lamest contest ever, right? So here's the contest. You're gorgeous, you're beautiful. We're going to take you from your home without asking you. We're just going to take you from your home because you're gorgeous. You're going to have to sleep with the king, and if he enjoys you better than all of the other women, then you have to marry him. What a lame contest. And that's where Esther comes in. Esther was beautiful. Esther was this Jewish girl who had been part of the exile. Her parents died, and she has this uncle named Mordecai. And because she's gorgeous, she gets summoned into the kingdom, is more beautiful, finds more favor than all of the other women, and wins this lame contest and has to marry the king. And that's incredible. So Mordecai is constantly walking around the kingdom because he loves his niece, right? So every day he walks up to the kingdom and he's like listening, finding out how she's doing. He cares. He wants to know if she's succeeding and doing well. He wants to see if he can get a glimpse of her because he loves her. And one day while he's doing that, he hears that there's these two soldiers who are plotting to kill the king. So he tells the king, and the king puts these guys to death immediately. Now, it's important that you remember that. Stick that in your back pocket because we're going to come back to it. He doesn't get immediately recognized for doing that. So this is where we meet the villain in the story, and his name is Haman. That's even a terrible name, Haman, right? So Haman is like one of the wealthiest people in all of the Persian kingdom. Some say that his wealth even exceeds that of the king himself. And so because he's so wealthy, like he's given special honor in front of the king, right? And he's actually made, when you have countries that have kings, he would be like the prime minister. So you have like the Queen of England, and then you have the prime minister of the UK. Do you know what I mean? Like he's powerful, influential, head of state, and he's given this position by Haman. And when he's given this position, he's so prideful and so rich and only cares about himself that he insists that the king make everybody bow down to him as he's walking down the street. Except for one guy refuses, and his name is Mordecai. Well, Haman hates this. Like he's so furious when Mordecai refuses to bow down, and his indignation is so complete and so full that he decides not only is he going to have Mordecai killed, but he's going to have all of Mordecai's people, the Jewish people, slaughtered. So Haman goes, he bribes the king, he gives him 10,000 talents, and he says, hey, let me send out a decree that says I can kill all of these Jewish people on a specific date throughout all of Persia, me and anyone else who doesn't like the Jewish people. So not only is he rich, not only is he prideful, but he's straight up an old school racist. And he hates the Jewish people. So he makes this plan, but God has other plans. When Mordecai finds out that this decree went out, like he's so upset, he rips his clothes. He's like, I'm so sad that this is happening. And that's like an indication in the Old Testament of how sad you are is when you rip your clothes. You see that happening a lot. They were so sad they ripped their clothes. And he sends a letter to Esther. He's like, Esther, you're the queen now. Like, you've been made the queen. You need to convince the king that this is a terrible idea. And Esther's like, I can't just show up. Like, I can't just go in front of the king because if you do that, you get killed. Remember that little rule? And then Mordecai sends a message back to Esther. He calls her out. He straight up calls her out. He's like, look, don't for a second think that just because you're the queen that they're not going to find out that you're Jewish and that you're going to not get killed too. All right? Don't forget who you are. Don't forget where you came from. And God is going to figure this out. Whether he uses you or somebody else, God has got this. He's going to take care of the Jewish people. But if you refuse to help, I promise you that you and your household are going to fall because of this. And then he goes, besides that, what's to say that God didn't send you to this place for such a time as this? What's to say that you're not queen exactly for the purpose of saving the Jewish people? She's like, man, that makes sense. So she agrees, and she hatches out this plan. She asks Mordecai and all of the Jewish people in Susa and in the area to fast for 3 days as she prepares this plan. And then she presents herself to the king, putting her life at risk, waiting. See, because the only way you could not be killed is if he puts out his golden scepter. And if he doesn't do that, you're dead. But if he does do that, then it's fine. So she goes before the king, unannounced. She bows down before him, and boom, he puts out the scepter so she gets to live. So she invites him and Haman to dinner for 2 nights in a row. Right? That's her big request. Come have dinner with me. I prepared a banquet just for you, just for Haman. So after the first night, Haman is just like bragging like crazy. He's like, man, I'm hot stuff. I'm the only one in all of the kingdom who got invited to have dinner with the queen and the king. You know, he's feeling confident. He's feeling cocky. He's like, I'm so confident that everything is coming up Haman right now that I'm going to go ahead and expedite my plan to kill Mordecai. And so that night, he has his servants build these gallows. The scripture says they're 40 cubits. In English, that's like 90 feet tall, to hang him from, because he hates Mordecai so much. But he's like, everything's going my way. I just had dinner with the king and queen. They loved me so much, right? So the next day, that night, it just so happens that the king couldn't sleep. And this is important. Remember at the beginning when Mordecai saved the king's life? At the very beginning, like that night, after the dinner, the king can't sleep. So what does he do? He calls his historians in to read the logs, talking about how great he is. And it just happens to read over that story that says, and then on this day at this time, Mordecai revealed a plot to have the king assassinated, and those 2 men were put to death. And the king's like, man, that's crazy. Did we do anything for Mordecai? And the historian's like, nope, we didn't do anything. So the next day, the king wakes up, Haman walks in, and he says, Haman, what should we do? What should the king do for someone that he truly wishes to honor in front of all the people? Well, Haman, like, he thinks he's hot stuff, right? He's like, obviously the king is talking about me. So he comes up with this crazy idea where he's like, I'm going to march him through the street with a horse. We're going to put royal robes on him. And then you're going to have like a lesser dignitary walk him around talking about how wonderful he is and how much the king likes him. And of course, Haman says all this thinking that this is going to happen to him because, of course, he's Haman, right? But then the king says, oh, wonderful idea. Why don't we do that for Mordecai, and you can be the one that's walking him around town, telling people how great he is. Can you imagine? Like Haman's like, what? Yeah, can you imagine in that moment what it's like? It's intense, right? So remember that morning Haman had planned on killing Mordecai before the end of the day, hanging him from a 90-foot gallows, but instead he's leading him through the town, praising him in a kingly robe on a king's horse, talking about all, like, that's God's providence, right? And so that night, immediately he gets home after that's done, and he's like, babe, I've had the worst day ever. She's like, had the worst day ever? Are you kidding? You need to let this go, Haman. Like, if you don't let this go, you're going to end up dead. Do you understand what I'm saying, you? And he's like, maybe, I don't know. You know, he's Haman. He doesn't care. He's not listening. But as soon as that happens, guess what it's time for? Banquet number 2. So he goes to the king and queen's like banquet that the queen had asked the king and Haman to come to. And the king's like, really, why are we doing all this? What do you really want, Esther? And she goes, someone sent out an edict saying that all Jewish people are going to be killed on this date. By the way, I'm Jewish, so on this day, I'm going to be murdered, me and all of my family. And the king's like, what? Who would do this? This is terrible. I love you. I didn't mean for that to happen. Who instituted this plan? And she goes, an evil, wicked enemy, Haman. And everybody's like, what? It's just insane. And the king is furious. He has Haman killed, hung from the rafters, and all of this other stuff. And every moment of the way, we see that Esther is trusting God to move. And it doesn't matter that God isn't mentioned throughout the whole story, because in the end, the king fixes this. He sends out an edict that says that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves on that day, and then the whole Jewish nation is saved. Mordecai is elevated to the prime minister position. Esther is allowed to remain queen. All the people are saved. Everybody's happy and better at the end. And every step of the way, we see God's presence, God's presence, God's presence. God made her beautiful. God made her favored. God gave her wisdom. God did all of these things. And it's just this incredible story. And through all of that, I know it's a long story, but through all of that, I can't help but think, man, this is like what it's like to be human, isn't it? Because there's so much about what Esther is going through that is totally out of her control, right? So first, her people are exiled because of like religious and political things that happen. And so she has to leave, like her family has to leave Israel, the only land that they've known, and they're exiled, and they're part of this foreign kingdom that doesn't understand them, that worships these foreign gods, and that's totally out of control. And then at a very young age, her parents die. Also, totally out of her control. And she's adopted by her uncle Mordecai, who loves her and raises her. And then one day, the king gets upset with his wife, totally out of her control. And she's forced to go to the kingdom and enter this terrible contest where the stakes are that she has to be, she has to sleep with this guy that she's never met. And if he enjoys her company, she then has to marry him. Not that she gets to marry him. It's not like Disney princess. She has to marry him. Right? And there are a lot of times where we are going through things and experiencing things that are completely out of our control, and it ruins our life. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of things and a lot of trouble and a lot of difficult situations that you experience because you make bad choices. But that's not really what I'm saying. Like, yeah, sometimes we make bad choices and we have to live in the consequences of those choices. But sometimes there are bad things that happen just because bad things happen. And here are 4 things that we learn from Esther. 4 things that we learn in those moments about how to navigate them. Because in those moments, it feels like you can't do anything, but that's not what we learn from Esther. In Esther, we learn that there are actually things that you can do in those situations. You do what you can do so God can do what God can do. And the first thing that we see is that at the very beginning, Esther gets wisdom. And in Esther chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, this is the first time she gets wisdom, right? It says, "So when the king ordered his edict and it was proclaimed, and the young women were gathered in Susa in the citadel in the custody of Hegai, who is the lead eunuch who takes care of all of the king's women, Esther was also taken to the king's palace and put into his custody." Later on, it says, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred. That means she didn't tell anybody that she was Jewish. Why didn't she tell anybody that she was Jewish? It says, Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Did you notice that her uncle Mordecai had advised her not to disclose that she was related to him or that she was Jewish? Why do you think that was? Could it be because he knew that Haman was the king's top advisor and that if he found out that she was Jewish, she would probably have him murdered just like he was trying to get Mordecai murdered? Like, that's providence, right? Like, that's wisdom. She trusted her uncle Mordecai because Mordecai knew things that she did not know. And it's difficult. Believe me, it's difficult to hide your identity. I 100% get that. Like, you want to be proud of your heritage and where you come from and all of that. And in this instance, like Mordecai said, don't tell anybody. So she trusted him. But it just didn't stop there. In Esther 2, we see her taking good wisdom too. In Esther chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, it says, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, had taken her as his own daughter to go to the king, she asked for nothing except for what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had been in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all of the women, and she won grace and favor, and she became queen. Why? Was it just because she was beautiful? No. It wasn't just because she was beautiful. It's because she listened to Hegai, who had been in the palace, who knew what the king liked, and he advised her, and she trusted him. Because she listened to Hegai and did what was advised, she became queen during the struggle. Esther trusted wiser people around her, right? And I know that that's difficult. Like, we don't ever think, man, I'm going through a difficult situation. I could really use some wisdom right now. But that's exactly what happened. And so the first thing that you need to do is you need to get wisdom. When I look back on my life and I think about all the people who poured into me, right? All the men and women who poured into me. Being young is hard, right? It's difficult because you're experiencing adult things, but you don't have adult experience. And so you don't always know what to do. So God puts these men and women in your life, and they have one thing that you don't. They've lived a lot longer. And they've gone through whatever it is that you're going through, and they've learned some lessons. So you should listen to them. And I get that it's hard, but you need to get wisdom. Kara Snyder, Mark Yarborough, Coach Garrett, Coach Cheeseborough, Virgie McNeil, Bob Yarborough, Robert and Tammy DeLuna, John and Christine Domingo. I think back about all the list of all the people who poured into me, who were godly and lived wiser lives than me, who loved me and took care of me. And I wonder what my life would be like without them. I have no idea where I'd be. Even beyond that, I wonder where I would be if I hadn't listened to them. Get wisdom. It all boils down to this. You're only alone in the middle of a struggle if you choose to be alone. God has put godly people around you. Proverbs 11:14 says, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety. James 1:5 reminds us, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to them. So who do you have in your life? Who can you be asking for wisdom? Or here's another question. Let's up it one. Who are you pouring your wisdom and life experience into? Not just who are you asking for wisdom, but if you're on the other side of that situation, who are you giving wisdom to? Who are you making yourself available to? If you're trying to figure out life by yourself, it's because you are choosing to do that. Let me prove it to you right now. There are over 4,000 people that call Sea Life home and attend on a regular basis. Certainly, out of 4,000 people, one of them can help you. One of them knows what you're going through. One of them understands, and it's up to you to reach out and ask. The second thing that we learn that Esther did was that she got courage. She got brave. After Mordecai found out that Haman had issued this decree, he tears his shirt because of this edict, and he immediately sends a message to Esther telling her to get the king to change his mind. And this is what she says, right? So she tells the messenger to send this back to him in chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. Then Esther spoke to the messenger and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servant and the people's kings and provinces know that if any man or woman goes before the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one who the king holds out his golden scepter that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king's room for 30 days. And she's saying to Mordecai, if you ask me to do this, you are asking me to die, because it's against the law to just show up in front of the king. And then Mordecai says that incredible thing in 10 through 17. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. And then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that the king's palace will help you escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you come to this kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther's like, that makes sense. And Esther replies to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or day or night. And I and my young women will do the same. We will fast. And then I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And here's what she says, if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And that is courage. That is bravery. Esther was unafraid of paying the cost of doing the right thing, even if it was going to cost her her life. And I really admire that about her, because that's genuine courage. Like Scripture tells us, greater love has no man than he who is willing to lay down his life for his brother. That's real courage. I remember when I was growing up, the greatest generation, my grandparents, that generation would say things like, never be afraid to pay the price for doing the right thing. You have to be willing to die for what you believe is right. And like those were really admirable traits. And I think that somewhere, especially like my generation and older, like that is a value that we hold near and dear to our hearts. And I admire that because it's a godly value. Lay down your life for your brother. Like lay down, be willing. Greater love has no man than he who lays down his life for his brother. But we don't always believe that now. And it's a problem. I remember the first time that I heard a pastor say something like this. He said, he was actually preaching, and he said, the first time I held my daughter, I knew that I would be willing to die for her. And beyond that, I knew that I would be willing to kill for her. And I thought, man, that doesn't sit right. And this is a preacher, right? And he's preaching this from the pulpit. And I thought, man, that is a value shift disguised as a cute story. But it really was a value shift, right? Where he elevated the willingness to kill over the willingness to die for those that you love. You see, one of those is godly. One of those is ego, right? The willingness to lay down your life is something that Christ did. It's something that we're taught to do. It's something that the time we're little boys that we're training ourselves to do, that we're told, heroes die, put themselves in danger for those that they love. But it got switched somewhere along the way, right? And so we see this value now where people think, oh, I'm willing to kill to protect my family. And then they brag about that. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't protect your family. Don't send your emails to me. Send them to David. dgriffin@clifec.com. But what I'm saying is that's a value shift. One is ego. One is great love. And so our motivation, because intention is everything. The reason you do things is everything. One is courage. Why do we call cops and firemen and soldiers heroes? Is it because of who they're willing to kill? No. We call them heroes because they wake up every day and they put themselves in harm's way for the greater love of their communities. That's heroic. That is courage. So adjust that thinking if it needs to be adjusted. Greater love has no man. And Esther teaches us this. Like she goes and she gets courage. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of love and of self-control. In your struggles, you are going to have to do some scary things. That is just the reality of difficult situations. You're going to have to make difficult transitions in your life. You're going to have scary procedures. You're going to have difficult conversations. You're going to have to cut people out of your life that you have loved forever. But you are fighting for your life. And when you are in a fight for your life, you need to get courage to do the right thing. 2 Corinthians 4:16-18 says, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. You are struggling to get rid of temporary things and fighting for eternal things. Things that matter, things that save, things that are good. Jim Elliot was a missionary who was killed for trying to share the gospel to an unreached people group, and he is famous for saying, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Listen to me, church. Hear what I am saying to you right now out of my mouth. Church, we need to get godly first. And then after that, we need to get courage because the world needs our hope now more than ever. So don't back down. Don't be afraid. Give your life up for the right things, for the godly things in this world, and be full of courage. The next lesson that we get from Esther is simply, after you get wisdom, after you get courage, you need to get help. I want to point out to you that after Esther listened to Mordecai and Haggai, and then she decided to be brave in Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17. This is what she does. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights, and I and my young women will also fast. And then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, and I perish." And Mordecai went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him to do. Do you see what she did there? Esther was unashamed to ask for help from other people. She was unashamed to seek spiritual support from the people around her because she knew that God was calling her to do this very, very difficult thing. So she reaches out. And she's unafraid to tell people what she needs. And we see this in Esther chapter 8, right? 3 through 5. She goes to the king in Esther chapter 8, 3 through 5, and she tells him exactly what she wants him to do. Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let another order be written revoking the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are all." She's like, if you love me, if I mean anything to you at all, revoke this thing that happened. She was brave, and she told him exactly what she needed from him. She was unafraid to tell the people in her life exactly what she wanted and what she needed. And this might seem like a ridiculous lesson, but hold on a second. Don't judge what I'm preaching here, because let me ask you a question. How many times do you suffer because you are unwilling to tell the people that God has put in your life what it is that you actually need? I mean, let's be honest. Like, you're struggling, you're going hungry, and the reason that you're doing that is because you are too prideful, too afraid to tell people who love you what it is that you want and need from them. Remember what I told you earlier? You are only alone in the struggle if you are choosing to be alone. Get help. Put your team together. Who is on your team? Like when you're struggling through some of the most difficult moments in life, when you're trying to overcome anxiety, you have like cancer and you need to have these surgeries, you're going through a difficult relationship moment in your life, you just lost your job, whatever it is, there are 1,000 things that it could be: illness, disease, famine, plague. It could be a global pandemic. I don't know. Whatever it is that you need, who is on your team helping you get through that? You see, that's why at Sea Life that we're so committed to this idea of community groups, because we believe that great things happen in community. We don't believe that God intended any of us to be by ourselves. So I'm asking you, like, if you need to put a team together, like this week, go to sealifec.com/no turning back and register to be in a CG. If you have a CG and you want to invite people into that group because you think, man, we have wisdom and we have resources and we're going to be able to help some people, then use your community group as that ministry and start inviting some people in. Register, do it. That's why they exist. Community groups are fun and you get to have a lot of fellowship, and we want them to be safe places for you to express yourself. But beyond that, we want them to be safe places for you to express yourself and become more godly. We want you ministering and holding each other up, praying and encouraging and building the body of Christ through those groups, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. God didn't intend for any of us to be alone. Don't hesitate. Invite people. Get help. Get your team together and let people know exactly what you need and ask them to do those things. And the final thing that we take from Esther is to get going. Right? Like that's the culmination of all of those. After she gets wisdom, after she gets brave and makes the decision to move, after she asks for all the help that she can have, she has to actually do the work. And this is the difficult truth, because all of the preparation means nothing if you don't do the work. There is no freedom without work. And you see this in the story, because the king was not able to reverse the edict. All he was able to do was add to it and say, I can't tell people not to kill the Jews on this day, but I can tell the Jews that they won't get in trouble for defending themselves. And that was enough. And even though the Jews had found God's favor in this story, they still had to fight for what was right. You see, There is this incredible scripture in Ephesians that emphasizes my point, and I know that you're familiar with it, especially if you've been in church for a long time, but we read over it so fast that it's lost all its meaning. Ephesians chapter 6, 13 through 14. Let me reread this to you as if you're hearing it for the first time. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the day of evil. And having done all, right? And then it stops, period. It says, take up the full armor of God. Day of evil, you're preparing. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand firm. Period. All stop. And then it says, stand, therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth and having put on the breastplate of righteousness. You see, after you have done everything that you possibly can do to stand firm, the next command is to actually stand firm. Philippians 2:12 says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good and pleasure. Work out your salvation. It's not enough to ask for faith, to pray for faith. You have to act in faith. And I see this over and over again. God doesn't say, I will remove your suffering. He says, I will be right there with you in the middle of your suffering. And some of y'all are paralyzed with fear. Some of y'all are thinking that God is just going to make your life easy and take away all your pain just because. You're praying for a miracle. You are praying for a miracle right now, and you don't even realize that the miracle is everything that God has already done in you and is doing in you now. So get to work, church. Get to work and start changing your life. God has saved you so that you could know life, but not just life to the fullest. So fight for what is yours, knowing that God is going with you. His presence is with you in the middle of a battle. Don't stand still. And we say this thing all the time in the church. We're always like, every week, every person has an opportunity to take a next step in their faith. Well, I'm throwing the gauntlet down right now. I have some next steps for you right this moment. Right this moment. Where are you in this process? Are you in the middle of a struggle trying to figure it out on this own? Then my challenge, your next step this morning is to go get wisdom. Go find some people who are older and wiser and godlier than you and ask them what you should do in this situation. I'm throwing the gauntlet down. You want to know what your next step is? That's your next step. Or maybe you're past that point, right? And you need to get courage. Right? You need to go and you need to ask people you just need to make a decision. You've gotten all the wisdom. You know what it is that you need to do. Now you need to pray and act and say, I need to be full of courage and I need to go have this difficult conversation. I need to take this difficult next step. Or maybe you already know what your plan is. Maybe you've gotten wisdom and you already know what your plan is and now you need to put your team together. So what are you going to do this week to put that team together? Right? Are you going to call some people? Are you going to say, hey, I need a CG, or I'm going to start a community group, or I need to make this appointment with a doctor, or I need to have this conversation with my friend? What are you going to do to get that team together? I'm throwing the gauntlet down because the final thing is you have to get going. Like, what difficult thing are you going to do this week to help you get to where you know God is calling you to go? Be brave. Don't listen to this message and then at the end of it continue to do nothing, but just sit in your struggle hoping that it'll go away, because it's not just going to magically go away on its own. God has given you people. He has given you resources. He has equipped you. He has called you to do what he is asking you to do. So do it, church. Father, I just come into your presence right now. I lift your people up to you, and I pray that this week that you would fill them with courage, that you would give them wisdom, that you would open their eyes to the people that can help them, that you would help them to have a plan and to act it out wherever it is they are, whatever it is that they are struggling with. Father, may your name be glorified through Christ our Lord. Amen.